Good morning, everyone, and thank you, Hannah, for that kind introduction. And thank you, Aviation Week, for the invite to speak at MRO Asia once again. And greetings from London. I'm sorry not to be in Singapore with you all. Obviously, a sign of these surreal times. So the focus today, it's the engine aftermarket and then sort of Oliver Wyman's perspectives on the outlook for that particular market. Next slide, and next slide, please. So three areas to talk about today. We're going to firstly kind of put COVID-19 into context. Can't do any conference speech these days without an overview of COVID-19, and then migrate quickly into kind of the overview of the fleet and MRO spend, the impact that we're seeing or we expect and anticipate in 2020 and through 2030. And then specifically, as we're talking engines in this space, going to give some insight into what we believe is going to be happening to the engine aftermarket with a global perspective and with an Asia Pacific perspective. So moving forward and on to the next slide, on the implications of COVID-19. We're clearly in unprecedented circumstances. This is going to be profound. It's going to be long term. This is not only a pandemic, it's going to, and some would say it already is, an endemic. And it's uncharted territory with respect to the health concerns, the impact on the real economy, the variation of government and actions and public health actions. The numbers you see really are going to assume that a widespread vaccine is not going to be available until mid-2021. We believe, as Oliver Wyman and we have a health and life services practice as well that also informs some of this content, the containment efforts will be successful, but we're not going to get herd immunity. There's going to be a lot of ongoing measures as the virus varies from county to country to region. And as a result of that, there's going to be sort of 12 to 18 months of iterative and partially controlled cycles of about outbreak and containment. And this is definitely going to be new normal. No surprises there for anybody of you listening. But aviation, airlines, aerospace, MRO, we are in many ways at the pointy end of the spear with respect to aviation, with respect to the COVID, and therefore significant impact as we all have felt already. Next slide, please. It's unprecedented with respect to aviation just because of the depth and scale of its impact. Firstly, not only on the economy, this is going to be the worst downturn probably since the Great Depression. The forecasters such as Economist Intelligence Unit and others are saying the GDP may well drop by around 5% in 2020. And on aviation specifically, on the bottom left there, it's by far the most profound global shock. On a global basis, we're getting more impact than the more regional specific events of 9/11 or SARS or the global financial crisis. You just look at the bottom left, the chart here on the left-hand side, and the depth of the impact on capacity in terms of available seat miles. COVID has meant, depending on which region, we've reduced ASMs by up to 80%, which was probably just about impacted that much with respect to SARS in Asia Pacific only. But in terms of the recovery, you can see the profiles of recovery of 9/11 and SARS and GFC. And SARS, for example, came back relatively quickly. We're anticipating the COVID recovery to be over a much longer period of time. Next slide, please. The immediate impact and most obvious one that you're all aware of is 2020 aircraft deliveries, 50% as expected. And that's by far the largest single-year decline in recent history. Terrorist attacks in 9/11, 4%. SARS actually didn't really impact deliveries at all. Global financial crisis, 5%, and COVID-19, we're anticipating deliveries to be of the order of 750. Moving on to the fleet and MRO spend impact. Global capacity is down 61%. That's the most evident thing here, and clearly it's still currently worse in some areas of Oceania, Latin America. Big markets of North America and Europe in year-on-year change, August, aircraft available seat miles down 60%. Asia, 54%. Why Asia 54% and the lowest? China, we believe, is a little bit of a harbinger or sort of leader in terms of how the market might behave in recovery, and we're seeing China coming back as it got it earlier, and they've got a large domestic regional marketplace. There's traffic coming back in Asia, and hence the available seat miles slightly better, but obviously by no means good performance in the Asia region. Next slide, please. Oliver Wyman, as you well know, we do these forecasts on an annual basis and have been doing these forecasts for many years. And therefore, over this period of time, we've been extremely active and have been updating our forecast virtually every kind of 6 weeks. Normally, our forecast gets updated once a year. And in these unusual times, it's been going on a very regular basis. As I mentioned, we do have a health and life sciences business unit within Oliver Wyman, and therefore you can't but avoid making sure you have a look at the epidemiological situation. And there are 4 factors that we've been trying to incorporate, or sorry, not been trying, we have incorporated into the forecast. Firstly, the timeline. We have a model called the Pandemic Navigator that's been used across our business, whether aviation or financial services or other industries. We've also been doing some surveys into traveller sentiment and passengers' willingness to travel. You can see more of those if you check out our website. Government restrictions are clearly having a massive impact. Certainly, if you look at the UK, we've been going in and out of sort of travel restrictions with different countries in Europe on a regular basis, and that clearly has an impact on whether passengers will travel. And then in the longer run, we have to take into account the macroeconomic impact, the impact on GDP, because as we all know, GDP has a strong impact on revenue passenger kilometres being flown. And therefore, you can take a view on what the recovery profiles will look like, whether it's a single wave, steady recovery, GDP bounce back. I think we've all recognised across the marketplace that is not going to happen. It may happen in single regions or single countries, but certainly not on a global basis. Multi-wave outbreaks, continual gradual recovery is one option, and then are we going to have a long period of time with large multi-wave outbreaks, depressed recovery, GDP impact? Clearly, probably most people's sentiment would be say that we're somewhere between nominal and prolonged on here. I think the other interesting debate that you need to have with yourselves is what are you measuring in terms of recovery? And it's almost as if there's multiple layers to that in terms of what dates you should associate with recovery. Leading edge indicator is clearly kind of the number of aircraft flying. As airlines either wish to stimulate demand or responding to demand in the marketplace, they're going to start getting their fleets out there and active. So your number of aircraft flying is one measure. However, those planes are probably not flying as hard as they used to. Maybe instead of flying 8 flights a day, they're flying 6 flights a day. So your next level is, well, how many hours are being flown by that active fleet? The next level might actually be the number of passengers carrying. And here again, you've got aircraft flying not quite as hard, but generally speaking, what we're seeing is that the average load factors are much lower. Last indicator would be revenue, because not only are the planes flying less hard, load factor is lower, but the yields are lower. So your lead indicator is really the number of airplanes or the utilization of those aircraft. And kind of, if you look to revenue, it's even going to be further to the right. So next slide, please. Looking here then at that active fleet, to some extent, that lead indicator that I just mentioned. We had 28,000 planes flying in January 2020. wasn't much different, frankly, through February and March, but a dramatic drop in April down to 12,700. A huge proportion of that active capacity taken out, parked, or went into storage. July, we were back to 19,500 as people kind of reacted and got a better view and perspective on the operations. We see the beginning of 2021 aircraft around about 23,000 flying, so still significantly fewer. And 2022 January's back to 27,000, so probably getting back to the same size of active fleet in calendar year 2022 at some point there. Next chart, please. So moving that in-service fleet forecast out and forward through to 2030, this covers passenger and cargo aircraft. So an 18% decline January 2020 to 2021 in terms of active fleet. And we see that active fleet growing at around about 3% per annum through to 2030. I think the conclusion here is obviously you're taking out a 2 to 3 years worth of growth. And if you compare our forecast fleet for 2030, the forecast from January this year to now, and look at 2030, there's about 4,700 fewer aircraft in the fleet in 2030. That's a lot of metal, that's a lot of flying hours, and therefore you can see a material effect either on OEMs or on the aftermarket ultimately over that decade. And the numbers will come out later to show what materiality for MRO spend. Next chart, please. We've had, or up until this point, we had 13 years of continuous growth. The airlines would take as many aircraft as the manufacturers would pump out. And we've seen the sort of year-on-year kind of ambition of Airbus and Boeing to increase their production rates, particularly on the narrow body. And as I said, the airlines would accept, or the lessors would accept as many planes as could be made. This, for the first time, is an unprecedented mismatch between kind of what Airbus and Boeing want to produce and the airplanes that the airlines are willing to accept. And there's now a disconnect between production and deliveries. So we see, in terms of aircraft production, a significant drop through into 2020. In terms of the number of planes that are going to be accepted, 750 aircraft in 2020. So a couple of observations on this particular case. Firstly, the 3-year production levels will not return to the scale of 2019, particularly in wide body over this period. The other observation is clearly the knock-forward effect of the 737 MAX. You've got a lot of planes that were manufactured of the MAX in 2019 that will ultimately be delivered, and therefore the impact on particularly Boeing production rates is going to be significant. Next slide, please. One of the key features of COVID-19 is the number of retirements that one has to build into the forecast. And as we all know, on average, aircraft tend to retire somewhere around that 24, 25, 26 year point. But because of COVID, we're seeing a unprecedented number of early retirements. So those planes that were in the kind of sunset end of the mature phase of their life, think about 747, think about maybe 767, the older A320s, 737 classics. We're going to see those fleets disappear much more rapidly than potentially we would have expected before, with some of them flying into kind of 30 years of age. Those will exit the fleet much faster as the sort of utility of those planes. Yes, they're paid down. They're paid down. Yes, they have lower sort of the fuel burn is not less impacted by the low fuel price, but we're still going to see an accelerated exit of those aircraft. Next slide, please. So what does that mean in terms of MRO spend? We're looking at a 40% drop in 2020. The recovery won't be properly until 2022. at some point in that year. We will get back to the same levels of spending, driven by that active fleet and the flying hours that that fleet will generate. I mentioned that we'd have over 4,000 less planes flying in 2030 in the previous chart. If you add up the impact of all of this reduced flying, reduced fleet over the 10-year period, and compare our forecast from January this year to now, it is effectively taking out 184 billion of MRO spend over the whole period. Next chart, please. Just dropping in briefly on the regional variations on the 2020 impact. Much like those available seat miles that we spoke about earlier, we're seeing on average, obviously, the impact in that sort of 45–50% range, but China, where there's been some recovery in the domestic market, more capacity being laid on by the airlines there, 26% drop in China, but across Asia Pacific or India, Western Europe, North America, rest of the world, it's all around that 45–50% mark. Next chart. Last but not least, the engine aftermarket. Next chart, please. The engine fleet, clearly with the reduced number of aircraft in service, then you have a reduced engine in service fleet. And in 2021, we believe that the active fleet will be about 11,000 engines less, with more than 7,500 engines of aircraft in storage. This will grow over that period of time from 2021. Probably more realistic to take a baseline number of 2019. If we use 2020 as a base year moving forward, I think there'll be some very high annual growth rates. So thinking about 2019 moving forward to 2030, we believe the engine fleet is going to grow around about an average rate of 2%. Compare that to probably what we were anticipating in prior years. Typically, the fleet has grown over the last 10 years of around about a rate of 3 to 5%. So we are seeing that long-term economic impact from the COVID crisis, reducing those overall average growth rates over the period of time. Thinking sort of, if you will, sort of post-COVID crisis, looking at that period of time from 2025 to 2030, we see the growth rate in the engine fleet of around about 3% per annum. Next slide, please. What's the impact on engine maintenance spend? In 2019, in our forecast there for last year, the engine MRO spend was around about 37 billion in 2019. We believe in 2020, the engine spend is going to be of the order of 23 billion, a 40% drop. Looking forward, once the market has stabilized from 2025 onwards, we're going to return to that kind of 3% annual growth rate. What's going to drive that? Narrow bodies. Clearly, most observers out there, and ourselves included, see the narrow body market recovering quicker than the wide body. I think, quite frankly, I think that in this world of uncertainty, that is one of the few certainties that you can actually bank on in terms of, firstly, domestic/regional traffic coming back, and then the wide bodies taking much longer time to recover, given the international sensitivities. Same period then, that 3.2% growth from 2025 to 2030, we believe that the wide body market will just grow at about 1.5% per annum. In positive mode, the engine MRO we expect to be around about 55 billion in 2030. So that is 50% higher than we anticipated the market in 2019. Next slide, please. For those of you in engine MRO, you're going to be interested in the number of shop visits. And we expect the number of visits in 2020 to be just over the 5,000 mark. And that's going to be sort of a 45% of decline from original expectations. Growth rate over the 2019-2030 period, slightly higher in terms of the number I gave you before, 2.9%, not a lot of difference though. Once again, observation is that there will be much more growth in the narrow body market. We see the wide body market probably from sort of 2019 being pretty flat overall in terms of the relative size between 2019 and 2030. Obviously a significant drop in 2020 for the wide bodies. And the estimate for the impact of COVID on the number of shop visits over the whole period is of the order of 15% or 13%. And that's a number of around about 16% fewer forecast shop visits. That comes from aircraft being retired, and it comes from a secondary effect of green time engines. Next slide, please. Anybody in the engine market, and particularly the engine OEMs, are going to kind of have almost what I might call a triple whammy. Certainly the OEMs will. Not only are the OEMs being affected by kind of the sort of less deliveries for line fit and for production, as engine maintenance shop visits are one of the largest areas to spend for airlines, with, as we all know, the narrow body engines may be sort of 3 to 5 million for a shop visit, wide body engines significantly more. It's one area where the airlines will very proactively seek to defer the shop visit, or, as I said earlier, if there's a shop visit due, they will look to retire that plane earlier as well. So less production, less shop visits. And then in addition, there's the third level, which is particularly important in engines. I could argue it's important in maybe APUs and landing gear as well, is the impact of green time aircraft and therefore engines, where you've parked a plane, you've got engines that have got a significant number of cycles in it, use that engine instead of incurring the shop visit. So we believe that the impact of green time engines probably going to reduce the number of shop visits by a further sort of 5% through 2024. And in our estimate, an additional 1.5 billion of spend will be taken out of the engine MRO market over the next 2 years. Next slide, please. Looking at Asia specifically, and the market for Asia Pacific, India, and China, in terms of the in-service fleet, so that lead indicator that I mentioned to you earlier. Overall, we believe over the period from 2019 to 2030 that engine fleet will grow at 4.3%. Once again, that narrow body fleet being much more sort of significant and above average. Wide body, much kind of more prevalent in Asia Pacific marketplace. The wide body aircraft, a higher percentage of the fleet concentrate on those aircraft. So 2.7% per annum growth in terms of those fleets. China and India in particular, taking those countries specifically, 5.9%, 11.2% growth in those particular markets. So we're seeing probably an increase of around about 10,000 aircraft in Asia Pacific over the period 2020 to 2030. Next slide, please. So in terms of engine maintenance spend, looking at again that period of 2019 to 2030, we see an expected growth rate in Asia of 6.2%. We've got the data for the rest of the world there. You can see that in the dark blue at the bottom, that's just 2.4%, and therefore, significantly below that global average. Asia is, as it was, quite frankly, before COVID-19, we're anticipating that it will continue to be one of the region with the largest sort of growth rates across the globe. Engine MRO probably returning to pre-COVID levels by the end of 2022. Over the second half of the forecast, we expect in 2025 through to 2030 growth rate of around about 4.2%. In 2019, the Asia Pacific region overall contributed or accounted for 30% of spend. We see that around 40% moving forward into 2030. So the spend for the audience here, the people who are providers of engine MRO, we're going to see a doubling of engine MRO spend by 2030. Next slide, please. What's going to drive that growth? What are the engine types that are going to be particularly impacting the marketplace? If we look at the combined number of shop visits by platform across the whole period of time, it's pretty clear that the sort of CFM56, so that's a combination of the 5B and the -7, that's going to be, it is and will continue to be a significant driver of the visits here, as it's a large scale fleet. In addition, there's going to be a growing proportion of those visits which are going to be on the LEAP engine. Particularly interesting in Asia, obviously, is with that predominance of wide body aircraft, the number of Trent visits and V2500 visits, obviously generated by the A320 platform. So kind of concentration on certain engine types in the region. But the graph on the right shows a quite dramatic sort of, shall we say, change of mix over the period of time. And you can see that the growth rate in terms of the number of shop visits required is very, very high on the LEAP. Moving forward, not much change in the Trent. Obviously, an increase in the PW gear turbofan. CFM56 pretty constant in terms of its volume, and the V2500, not much change in the size of those, but the clear message from the right-hand chart is to make sure for those who are not, who are on the LEAP program, to make sure there's enough capacity. For those who are not, potentially the LEAP there is a source of longer-term growth. Next slide, please. And that's the end of the talking. A couple of points. The charts will get circulated post this. In what gets circulated, there'll be a few more numbers charts, so that you get a little bit more insight into certain aspects, such as the number of aircraft in storage over this over this period of time. If anybody's got specific questions on the material, feel free to contact me. Otherwise, thank you for listening, and I'm looking forward to your questions and hopefully being able to answer them.